any case, this was the beginning of the end. Now that the king had united himself with the Vaishyas, it was able to take power away from the other lords. You have to keep in mind that in the feudal era, it wasn't like an absolute monarch. The king had to work with these kind of regional governments. It's very kind of similar to, I say, to the federal government, and then you had like states. Well, you had like a king of France, and then you had various regions around France, and they would have their own lords and barons and dukes, and I don't know how all the whole system worked, but the aristocracy. And so it was very complicated. But and of course, a lot of these people would resist Philip the Fair and his power grab, his trying to acquisition of wealth. And so to kind of suppress them, he unites himself with the bourgeoisie to take them on. He basically becomes one of the first, or France becomes one of the first absolute monarchies. Later on, we'll see other countries become like that. And we see the principle now that France was built on was no longer Catholicism. It was no longer seen as this nation that was united with all Christendom, and that its central principle was the Catholic Church. Rather, now its central principle was this king, this temporal leader. And so we see now the suppression of the metaphysical principles. And once you start suppressing these metaphysical principles, once you try to overthrow and undermine the principle, this eternal principle that has to basically be the foundation, this unmoved mover upon which you can kind of build the statue or the structure of society. Imagine like this water bottle here, you have the foundation. This is kind of like what the church is supposed to be, to provide the foundation. And as you go up the foundation, you get farther and farther from it. And so basically remove the foundation. And so the whole thing begins to sink. The entire civilization begins to sink. And at first it's very slow, because the knights and the kings, they're still to some extent virtuous people. They still cared about, they're still statesmen. So this time was, very long lasting. And then, of course, the much more greedy, much more avarice, much filled with cupidity, the third estate and the bourgeoisie overthrew the monarchs in the French Revolution, and we see this also in the American Revolution and other revolutions in Europe. And then we see kind of the rise of now liberalism. And when the Kshatriyas, they were in control, the way that they were able to reinterpret, now the church no longer had a monopoly on metaphysical knowledge, because they're the only ones who can truly understand metaphysical knowledge. Now we saw rationalism appear. We saw Descartes, we saw Kant, we saw Leibniz, we saw Spinoza, we saw these Hume and Locke, we saw all these Enlightenment thinkers rise up, and the way that they interpreted tradition was very different. We saw them come at things from a very individualistic perspective instead of seeing things from a very hierarchical point of view, with God at the center of everything. But they weren't, a lot of them weren't terrible. Leibniz was a substance pluralist. They all believed, most of them believed in God, though they were drifting far from the church. And then once the Vaishyas took over, then the principles in which the Vaishyas operate, things like commercialism and merchandise, became everything. Everything became commoditized. That is what liberalism is, really. That is what the society we're living in is. It's taking these principles of economy and now applying it to everything. Now, when we talk about immigration, we're talking about supply and demand. Now, we're talking about a people here, a nation. I don't care about these economic principles if there's something higher and more important at stake. And yet that seems to be, one of the things that most people who are economic, or rather immigration hawks or doves, they always want to bring up is these immigration perspectives. And I can understand if you're trying to just convince people who already have this presupposition that maybe that's what you're going to go for. But just the fact that people have this presupposition in the first place, that the way we should come at these things through this economic angle, is very concerning. Another one is like wages. Like thinking about the fact that there's a just wage. We're not, I know that the libertarians want to tell you that we should just apply the laws of supply and demand that we apply to commercial goods, and which is how we determine prices. We should just apply them to people and to workers, and that's how we should determine wages. But that's not how the church teaches us at all. We have human dignity, we have value, and we need a system that reflects that. And a system that is run by the merchants, that's run by the bourgeoisie, is not going to have that. Instead, they're going to have, like I said, commercialism, consumerism. That is going to be the directing principle on which the society is now built. It's no longer the king and the king's virtues. It is no longer the church and God's higher order. It is now commercialization and the materialism. That is now the thing that is kind of the governing principle on which unfortunately, our state and our, be honest, our civilization is now dependent on. And this period is going to be shorter last than the last. In the next period, of course, then, the prediction of René Guénon is that the Shudras rise up, basically the proletariat overthrow the bourgeoisie. We already just saw hints of this with communist revolutions in China and other places, and in Russia. We'll see if something like that happens again in the West. But in any case, René Guénon says that each of these revolts, the revolt of the lower caste against the higher caste, and then the way that they're going to interpret basically whatever principle it is that they're going to build society on is going to be based on their caste. And the further they are removed from the ability to have the aptitude to receive metaphysical knowledge, as say the Brahmins, further removed from that caste, the more society is going to be built around materialistic principles and less upon pure knowledge and pure metaphysics.